From Bell Direct in Sydney for more on the market movements today. And just looking into the second hour of trade now, Leanne, we're up about 0.5%. So good gains, but I'm assuming ahead of this ECB meeting we might be a little bit cautious.
Ingrid, you could be right. I do think those gains, obviously, we're seeing on our market is coming across from those positive leads we've had from European markets in particular, but of course over in the US as well. But I think the markets really have been rallying ahead of this ECB meeting tonight, as you say, where we are expecting a huge increase in that bond buying program. I do think markets are pretty heavily pricing in these expectations. So if we do actually see any disappointment coming through tonight from the ECB, I do think that markets potentially could tumble. So it will be interesting coming into the afternoon how in fact our market does react and whether we do in fact pull back and be a bit cautious ahead of that ECB meeting tonight. But nonetheless, it doesn't seem to be the case this morning, seeing a really positive performance today. Obviously following that positive performance we had yesterday, I think expectations about that ECB meeting tonight have certainly driven those commodities higher overnight as well. As a result, we are seeing strength in that materials sector. We saw iron ore off about 0.5%, but on the flip side we saw copper, aluminium and nickel both all higher. We also saw West Texas oil up about 2% overnight, and also seeing that energy space performing strongly, and of course financials as well. So the three biggest sectors really of the market. On the other side of it, the worst performers continuing to be those telcos, healthcare, so some of those high yielding and defensive sectors. Of course the property sector as well coming under a little bit of pressure today. But I think in the absence of any major economic data that we have coming out locally, it certainly is those positive leads that we are following this morning, and potentially leads coming from around the region, obviously ahead of that meeting tonight.
All right, we've had some more production report numbers today. Evolution Mining for one, out with pretty strong, well, I mean, at least the investors are reacting pretty strongly. It's up about 3.2%. What do you make of the numbers?
Ingrid, it actually looked like a very strong report that came through. We saw record production numbers, record costs, and also record cash generation. So if we look at their production, up about 5.7% for the quarter. That's actually the highest production that we've seen since the company started about 3 years ago. If we look at their all-in sustaining costs, down 8% on the quarter and down about 10% on the average that we saw in FY14. And again, that was a record low cost coming through since the company started. And finally, looking at their cash generation, we actually saw all of their operations in cash flow positive territory. Their cash flows were up a huge 133% over the quarter to about $40 million, and that puts them in a very strong cash position, up about 25% to $47 million. So looking like that balance sheet is very strong. In addition to that, the outlook commentary also looked fairly positive. They've maintained their FY15 guidance, and of course expecting their costs to actually come in at the lower end of their guidance range. So all of that certainly looked very positive, seeing a really strong reaction from investors today, particularly looking at their Edna May gold mine, which is over in Western Australia. We actually saw a very pleasing performance out of there. It's typically in the past been one of their higher cost producers, and there was a bit of speculation or concern about this mine early in 2014, some speculation they might be looking to sell that mine, but it does look like they've actually come quite a long way, and they are successfully addressing a lot of those issues. We saw their production up 40%, which was a record. We also saw their costs down a huge 43%, so very pleasing out of that one. And I think the outlook for this one looks fairly positive, particularly given those gold prices, their focus on exploration, and of course their focus on reducing those costs, but certainly seeing a really positive performance today.
All right, also looking at Perpetual, it's actually just turned negative, that stock, or actually pretty flat. What did you make of it? Because it released second quarter funds under management.
It did, Ingrid. Interesting, because we saw it performing quite strongly when it did come online. If we look at those numbers, it was the 6th consecutive quarter of positive cash flows, net flows I should say, which really contributed to a pretty strong first half result for the company. So a lot of those numbers actually looked fairly pleasing. For the quarter, we saw their closing funds under management up about $1.1 billion to $31.8 billion. We also saw net flows of about $500 million million. And of course, that was helped out mostly by those institutional channels, and also their first listed investment company, which raised about $250 million. Also, of course, continuing to gain approval and access to some of those platforms and, of course, model portfolios as well. So those numbers actually looked fairly pleasing. The result looked quite solid, particularly given a lot of the volatility and the difficulty in markets over the last quarter or so. So interesting that we have seen that share price pulling back somewhat. Recently, actually, back in December, we saw Bell Potter downgrading this stock from a buy to a hold, and that was mostly as a result of the share price appreciation that we had seen in the stock from about the end of October to about December last year. It was up about 14%, but since that note, we have actually seen that share price pulling back about 5% or so, probably waiting for it to come back a little bit more before we turn more positive on it. But I certainly think one of the positive catalysts going forward is the continued progress in terms of that trust company acquisition, which came through back in December 2013. Certainly that integration remains on track, and also some of those cost savings. So I think the underlying fundamentals look strong. Certainly a strong and solid result today.
Yep, and it
will be interesting to see how it does perform.
And just in that 1 minute or so of you talking, it's gone up 0.4% again, so it's back in the black. All right, Leanne, we'll leave it there.